So, this is a story about a lady from our church who, honestly, had a pretty humble life, or at least that's what most of us thought. Her name was Mrs. Adams, and she was one of those people who radiated warmth, kindness, and genuine care for others. She was a retired nurse, never married, and didn't have children. A quiet, peaceful woman who seemed content with her life, always involved in church activities and helping wherever she could. Now, my wife and I were close to Mrs. Adams. She was almost like a grandmother to us. Whenever there was a church event, she was there with a smile, and she'd always be ready to help. I remember her talking about her small apartment, which she always described as cozy and filled with beautiful things. She'd mentioned the crystal and silverware she inherited from her parents and the lovely vintage furniture that filled her living room. Little did we know, that was about to change. Big time. Then, one day, we got the call. Mrs. Adams had suffered a heart attack. It wasn't a massive shock. She was in her 80s, and her health hadn't been great for a while, but it still hit hard. We rushed to the hospital, and when we got there, she was in stable condition but still very weak. I remember sitting with her, holding her hand, telling her everything would be all right. She smiled at us, weakly, but there was something in her eyes that seemed a little distant. Maybe she was just exhausted, but it felt like there was more to it. Anyway, after the heart attack, things started to shift in a way I never expected. A few days later, her niece and nephew arrived. Now, these two were, well, let's just say they were hardly ever around. I had never seen them at church, and I can't recall a single time they'd visited Mrs. Adams in the years I'd known her. But suddenly, they were there, swooping in like vultures. They started taking her things, her crystal, her silverware, and, really, anything that looked valuable. At first, I thought they were just clearing out some things she didn't need for her hospital stay. But no. It was worse than that. They were taking everything. Her beautiful antique furniture, her dishes, even the little knickknacks she cherished. I didn't say anything at the time, because it wasn't my place. But I could tell my wife was furious. She kept shooting them angry glances, and I could see Mrs. Adams wasn't happy about it either. But she didn't say anything, and maybe that was part of the problem. The whole situation left a bad taste in my mouth. It felt wrong, you know? Like they were already planning for her to be gone, even though she was still hanging on. A few weeks later, Mrs. Adams was discharged from the hospital and came home. I still remember the look on her face when she walked into her apartment for the first time after the heart attack. She stood there in the doorway, just staring. Her eyes scanned the room as if she couldn't quite comprehend what had happened. And honestly, neither could I. Her place was completely different. The furniture was gone, the crystal and silverware were nowhere to be seen. All that was left was a few old, mismatched chairs and a sagging couch. She didn't say anything for a while, just stood there, frozen in the doorway. Finally, she sighed and quietly asked, "Where did everything go?" It was one of those moments that I'll never forget. You could see the hurt in her eyes. I wanted to tell her that her niece and nephew had taken everything, but I didn't know how. What was there to say? That it felt like they were preparing for her death long before it actually came? It wasn't just the stuff they took, it was the memories. They had stripped her of things that held sentimental value, things she'd worked hard for. At that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about all of this. I tried to reassure her, told her that she could get new things, that she didn't need to worry. But I could tell she was already resigned to the fact that this was just how things were going to be from now on. It was like the sense of dignity she once said was stolen along with her belongings. She didn't press the issue. Mrs. Adams just quietly accepted her new, empty reality. But that moment hit me harder than I thought it would. Something about it didn't sit right with me. And I knew I had to find out more. Something was off. A few years passed, and life seemed to return to a quiet, routine pace. Mrs. Adams was getting older, but she was still sharp as a tack and involved in church activities. We continued visiting her, bringing her meals, and helping out where we could. But every now and then, I noticed that same sadness in her eyes, that lingering feeling that something had been taken from her, something more than just her belongings. Then, one day, we got the news, Mrs. Adams had passed away peacefully in her sleep. It wasn't a surprise, considering her age, but it still felt like a punch in the gut. We all gathered at the church for the memorial, and as we mourned the loss of someone who had truly touched our lives, there was also a sense of, well, I guess, curiosity. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mrs. Adams' life than what we saw on the surface. And then came the will reading. I wasn't expecting much. I figured Mrs. Adams would leave behind a few modest possessions, maybe some money to the church, given how dedicated she was to it. But the will, oh man, the will took everyone by surprise. It was dated after her heart attack, which was kind of strange to begin with. The lawyer stood up, cleared his throat, and read her last wishes aloud. Mrs. Adams left the sum of $1 each to her niece and nephew. There was a small gasp in the room, and I could feel the air shift. The niece and nephew, who were sitting right there, looked shocked. I mean, you could see the blood drain from their faces. But that wasn't the kicker. The lawyer continued, his voice steady, and the rest of her estate, valued at $9 million, is to be donated to the church. I don't think anyone in that room could breathe for a second. $9 million. Mrs. Adams, who'd seemed so modest and humble, had a fortune hidden away. And not only that, but she'd left it all to the church, no strings attached. No one knew about the estate or the hidden wealth. I could see the niece and nephew, who had stolen her things, practically squirming in their seats. You could tell they were stunned, and not in a good way. They had obviously expected something different. The rest of us, though, we were left with our mouths hanging open. It was like we were all learning about a completely different side of Mrs. Adams. And as for me? I was just trying to process it all. Mrs. Adams had been a kind, humble lady, and yet she'd held on to a fortune that no one had ever suspected. But it wasn't just the money, it was the fact that she had thought carefully about her final actions. She knew exactly what she was doing when she made that decision. You could tell that the niece and nephew were furious, but they tried to play it cool, like they were expecting something better. The nephew, a guy in his 40s, leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, while the niece, a woman probably in her late 30s, kept shifting uncomfortably, glancing at the lawyer like she thought she could somehow talk her way out of it. They had the audacity to ask the lawyer about the will. They wanted to know if there had been any mistakes, if there was any possibility to challenge it. The lawyer was firm, though. He explained that everything was legally sound and that Mrs. Adams had made her wishes crystal clear. The rest of the estate was going to the church, and there was no way around it. At that moment, the anger in the room was palpable. I could see the bitterness on their faces, and it made me sick to my stomach. For years, these two had barely lifted a finger to care for Mrs. Adams. They took her things when she was vulnerable, and now they were trying to lay claim to a fortune she had never even told them about. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what they'd done to her, how they treated her like a means to an end. To me, it felt like the real inheritance wasn't the money or the property, it was the message Mrs. Adams had left behind. She'd stripped them of any hope of an easy handout. In her final act, she'd made sure they got nothing but a token amount and showed them how little they mattered to her in the end. But even then, I couldn't help feeling a little sorry for them. They were going to have to live with the knowledge that their greed had cost them everything. What was it all for, after all? What did they think they'd win by taking her things? In the end, they had nothing but a few empty possessions and a bitter taste of their own actions. I couldn't imagine how they felt, sitting there, realizing they'd been shut out of a fortune that, in a twisted way, they thought they had already claimed. They had been so sure of themselves until they weren't. It didn't make me feel better, though. What had happened was still messed up. Mrs. Adams had trusted them enough to let them into her life, and they repaid her with cold indifference. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal she had suffered or the fact that it had all been so avoidable. The fallout from the will reading didn't end there. The niece and nephew made their exit from the lawyer's office pretty quickly, and from the looks on their faces, I didn't think they had any intention of letting this go. They were already scheming, trying to figure out a way to reverse what Mrs. Adams had decided. But what could they do? The will was ironclad, and the church wasn't about to back down either. The church, on the other hand, was in a bit of shock as well. I remember the pastor standing in front of the congregation a few days later, trying to address the situation. He spoke about Mrs. Adams' generosity, about how she'd always been a quiet, unassuming presence, and how her last act was a final gift to the community. But there was something in his voice, too, a sort of uneasy caution. He knew the money would be transformative, but he also knew the implications. It wasn't just a windfall, it was a statement. Still, the church had no intention of backing away from Mrs. Adams' wishes. They started making plans to use the funds for projects that would benefit the community, like building new facilities and expanding outreach programs. But as time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play here. Mrs. Adams had planned this. She had known what would happen. Maybe she'd been biding her time, watching how the niece and nephew treated her, and finally, when they showed their true colors, she decided to make sure they got nothing. What hit me the hardest, though, was the realization that she'd been playing a long game. Maybe she'd known all along that they'd take her things, that they'd take advantage of her. She probably never said anything because she didn't want to cause trouble, but it was clear that she'd been hurt, deeply, by the way they treated her. I couldn't help but think about how many other people in her life had probably taken her for granted. I thought about how many times she must have swallowed her frustration and kept it to herself, never voicing her displeasure. And now, in the end, she'd left us with a painful truth: sometimes, people don't change. They don't become the people we hope they'll be, no matter how much we wish they would. It wasn't just the money that made this whole thing so tragic, it was the way it showed what people were capable of, and how Mrs. Adams, despite her kindness, had to take matters into her own hands just to protect herself. For a while, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. I kept thinking about Mrs. Adams, her life, and what it all meant. I wondered if she had ever been really happy, or if her kindness had always come at the expense of her own peace of mind. She had been so giving, so selfless, always putting others first, yet when it mattered most, the people closest to her had betrayed her. I couldn't help but feel guilty. I mean, sure, I had been there for her, visiting her in the hospital, helping out when I could. But had I done enough? Had I really been as present as I could have been? If I had known how her niece and nephew would treat her, would I have done more to stand up for her, to protect her? I kept coming back to the way they treated her things. It wasn't just the material loss, but the disrespect. They hadn't just taken her possessions, they had taken her dignity. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done something about it sooner. Maybe I should have said something to them when I saw them carting off her belongings. Maybe I could have said, "This isn't right," and stopped them before they stripped her apartment bare. But in the end, I didn't. I stood by and watched. I wasn't the one who directly stole from her, but I wasn't innocent either. In a way, I had let it happen, and that guilt weighed heavily on me. Maybe that's why I felt so strongly when I saw her final decision. She had known all along. She had protected herself, in the only way she could, by making sure that after she was gone, there would be no room for the kind of greed that had ruined so many families. I think that's what Mrs. Adams' legacy really was, not just the money she left behind, but the lesson she taught all of us. You can be as kind and generous as possible, but there comes a time when you have to take control of your own life, your own decisions. It might hurt, but sometimes, you have to put yourself first even if it means cutting out the people who you thought would always have your back. I guess I understood that now. It took me a while, but I finally got it. The wake was a strange experience, to say the least. I expected it to be a time of mourning, of sharing memories about Mrs. Adams, and of comforting each other. But instead, it turned into something different entirely. The niece and nephew showed up, of course. They still acted like they were entitled to something, despite everything that had happened. They hovered around the church, eyeing the proceedings with thinly veiled resentment. I couldn't help but notice how awkward they made everyone feel, as if they were still trying to claim what was rightfully theirs, even after the will had been read. But the rest of us? We tried to keep things light. We shared stories of Mrs. Adams, how she'd helped us during tough times, how her laughter could brighten the room, how her compassion seemed endless. For a while, the weight of the situation almost lifted. It felt like we were honoring her in the best way possible. And then, out of nowhere, something unexpected happened. A young woman, someone none of us recognized, showed up at the church. She was in her late 20s, dressed in simple clothes, but she had a confident air about her. She approached the pastor and whispered something in his ear. The pastor nodded and excused himself from the group. He walked over to the newcomer and led her up to the front. It was clear this woman had something important to say. She stood there for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the room. There was a palpable tension in the air. We all held our breath, wondering what this could be about. The woman turned to the congregation and introduced herself. "My name is Clara. I'm Mrs. Adams' granddaughter." The room went silent. No one had ever heard of a granddaughter. Mrs. Adams had never mentioned a daughter or any children. We all exchanged confused glances. The niece and nephew, for once, seemed speechless. Clara went on to explain that she had been estranged from Mrs. Adams for years. Her mother, Mrs. Adams' estranged sister, had been a troubled woman, and Clara had grown up in foster care after her mother's passing. She had always known about Mrs. Adams but never felt welcome, given the circumstances surrounding her family. But after hearing about her grandmother's passing and the inheritance, Clara felt compelled to step forward. She had tried reaching out to Mrs. Adams before the heart attack, but by then, it was too late. It was an awkward moment, to say the least. But it brought something else to light: the complexity of family dynamics, the unseen parts of Mrs. Adams' life that none of us knew about. Her past, her estrangement, the things she had kept hidden, even from us. I looked over at the niece and nephew. They were no longer angry, but their faces were pale. I could tell they hadn't expected this. Clara didn't seem to be there for the money, though. She spoke about wanting to honor Mrs. Adams, to find a way to make up for the lost time and reconnect with the family she'd never known. I watched the entire exchange, torn between feeling uncomfortable and oddly moved. This was another layer to the story, one that no one had expected. Mrs. Adams' life had been more complicated than we ever realized, and it was clear that even in her death, she was still revealing truths that changed everything. As the days went on after Clara's revelation at the wake, things became even more complicated. I couldn't stop thinking about her sudden appearance. It felt like a bombshell had been dropped on us. For all this time, we had seen Mrs. Adams as this lonely, self-sufficient woman who kept to herself. She had been so kind, so welcoming, and yet we knew so little about her private life. It was hard to reconcile the woman we thought we knew with the one Clara described. The niece and nephew were still processing it all, and they didn't handle it well. They didn't speak much to Clara, but their body language made it clear they weren't happy with her presence. They were already out of the picture as far as the inheritance was concerned, but now there was this other piece to the puzzle, and they didn't know how to deal with it. I could see the resentment building up in them again. It was like their last hope of holding on to something from Mrs. Adams had been ripped away. I wanted to reach out to Clara, to offer some kind of support, but I didn't know how. It wasn't her fault that she'd been estranged from Mrs. Adams for so long. In fact, I admired her for coming forward. She could have easily stayed in the shadows, let the inheritance drama unfold, and walked away with nothing, but she didn't. She seemed to genuinely want to connect with her grandmother, to make amends, and that struck me. In the weeks that followed, Clara began showing up at the church more often. She was quietly involved, helping out with community projects and getting to know the people who had known Mrs. Adams. I think she was trying to find a place for herself in this new family, even if it was a bit awkward. No one knew how to act around her at first, and I could tell some people still felt unsure. But gradually, she started building relationships, earning trust, and finding a place in the church community. What struck me most was the contrast between her approach and the way the niece and nephew had handled everything. Clara wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't trying to take what was left behind, like they had. She was simply trying to make up for lost time, and that made her stand out in the most humbling way. As for me, I started to wonder, what was Mrs. Adams thinking all along? Had she known about Clara? Had she always hoped she'd come back into the fold one day? Or was this just another example of the secrets we keep, of the lives we don't share with others, even the ones closest to us? I began to think that maybe Mrs. Adams had been protecting herself in more ways than one. Not just from her greedy relatives, but from a deeper hurt, the pain of family betrayal, the loss of a child she could never reconcile with. I had always seen her as this pillar of strength, but now I realized she had been carrying a lot of weight on her shoulders. I began to feel a deep empathy for her, more than I ever had before. And strangely enough, I started to feel a connection to Clara too, in a way. It was like we were all trying to pick up the pieces of Mrs. Adams' life, to understand her better, even after she was gone. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. Maybe we weren't supposed to fully understand her. Maybe the whole point of Mrs. Adams' life, and her final decision, was to leave us with more questions than answers. Maybe she had done that on purpose, to teach us that not everything can be neatly wrapped up or tied together. Some things are just too complicated, too personal to be fully understood. And maybe that was her greatest lesson. After everything settled down a bit, I started to realize just how much Mrs. Adams' death had affected me. Not just the estate drama, or the revelation about Clara, but the whole situation. The way I had seen her life, her selflessness, her quiet strength, had completely shifted. I had always admired her, but now I saw her in a new light. She was someone who had given so much to others, yet had carried a lot of pain that no one had ever really seen. It was hard to move on from the wake, hard to let go of the anger I felt toward her niece and nephew, but more than that, it was hard to let go of the guilt I had been carrying. I couldn't change what had happened, I couldn't undo my silence when Mrs. Adams needed someone to speak up. But I had learned something important from all of this, about standing up for what's right, about seeing people for who they truly are, and about accepting that some things will always remain out of our control. I had to make a decision. Would I let the bitterness from everything that had transpired cloud my judgment, or would I choose to honor Mrs. Adams' legacy by being a better person, by being more present and more aware in my own life? It wasn't easy. I'm not going to lie, I had moments when I wanted to just walk away from it all. But something inside me kept pushing me to stay involved, to stay connected, especially with Clara. She had no one else, and I could see she was genuinely trying to find her place in this fractured family. I didn't know what it would look like or if it would even work, but I felt a responsibility to help her, just as Mrs. Adams had once helped me, even when I hadn't fully realized it. So, I started spending more time with Clara. We began talking about her grandmother, and she shared stories with me about the times she remembered, bits and pieces of Mrs. Adams' life that I hadn't known. It was like uncovering a new chapter of a book, one that was written with a different perspective. Clara didn't just want the money, she wanted to understand the woman her grandmother had been, to fill in the gaps of a life that had been kept at arm's length for so long. It was slow progress, but eventually, I felt like I was doing something meaningful. Instead of focusing on the hurt, the disappointment, and the betrayal, I decided to channel my energy into positive change. I began volunteering more at the church, helping out with the community outreach that Mrs. Adams had been so passionate about. I figured if nothing else, I could help carry on her work, even if she wasn't around to do it herself. The decision to move forward wasn't one I took lightly. But it was something I needed to do, not just for Mrs. Adams, but for myself. Because at the end of the day, life keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. And if there's one thing I'd learned through this whole experience, it was that the best way to honor someone's memory isn't by holding on to the past, it's by making something positive out of what they've left behind. Over time, I began to see the cracks in my own life that needed mending, and surprisingly, that started to feel like the real work. Mrs. Adams had shown me the power of living quietly but with intention. She had given without expecting, loved without reservation, and in her final act, she had sent a message that had to be heard, even if it was difficult for some of us to grasp. I wasn't just rebuilding trust with others, I was rebuilding trust with myself. For years, I had been passive, letting things happen around me without taking a stand when I should have. Watching Clara find her way back to Mrs. Adams and hearing her struggle to reclaim lost time made me realize how much I had let slip through my own fingers. There were relationships I'd ignored, things I had been too afraid to address, or simply too apathetic to confront. But Mrs. Adams' life had shown me that silence can be a kind of complicity, and that sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that require us to step out of our comfort zones. It was easy to accept the status quo, to move along with the flow of life, but real growth, real change, required stepping into the unknown. Mrs. Adams' decision to leave everything to the church, her willingness to trust that people would do right by her wishes, made me realize that sometimes, taking risks with your heart is the only way to move forward. I started thinking more about my own relationships. Was I really present in them?
Did I speak up when something felt wrong? Or had I been sitting quietly, waiting for things to fix themselves? It was a hard pill to swallow, but it became clear that just like Mrs. Adams had had to make a hard decision with her inheritance, I needed to make decisions about my own life, about the people I allowed into it, and about how I would show up for others. Clara's presence at the church was a reminder of how important it is to rebuild, how, even in the face of family secrets and disappointments, there's always an opportunity to try again, to make a different choice. Clara was still trying to build connections with her grandmother's friends, and while it wasn't always easy, I respected her for it. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or even sympathy. She was just there, doing the work, learning the lessons, and slowly earning the trust of those around her. That was something I could get behind. As for the niece and nephew? Well, they faded into the background. They didn't come around much after the will reading. I think they realized there was no point in trying to contest it anymore, and besides, the church wasn't exactly offering them much to cling to. They were left to reconcile with their own decisions, and whatever guilt they might have been carrying would eventually catch up with them. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't my place to dwell on their consequences. The real focus, for me, was on healing the fractures in my own life, on being better than I had been before. Mrs. Adams had shown me, in her final actions, what it meant to take ownership of your life even in the face of betrayal and to ensure that your legacy lived on in the right way. That's what I was working toward now, not just fixing things, but transforming them into something meaningful. As time passed, I found myself more involved in the church than I ever thought I would be. I guess, in a way, Mrs. Adams' passing had created a shift in me that wasn't just about honoring her, it was about discovering a new purpose. I began to understand the deep sense of community that she had been a part of all these years, and how, in some ways, I had been blind to it. I wasn't just volunteering anymore, I was becoming a part of the fabric of something bigger. Clara, too, became more of a fixture at the church. At first, it had been uncomfortable, she was an outsider, after all. But over time, as she continued to quietly work with the congregation, she earned a place. It wasn't easy for her, but she didn't expect it to be. And that made her story even more powerful. It wasn't about the inheritance. It was about the relationships she was rebuilding, the connections she was making. She wasn't trying to erase the past, she was trying to acknowledge it and make something positive out of it. I often found myself talking with Clara after church services, sharing little moments of insight or just listening to her talk about her experiences. It became clear that, much like Mrs. Adams, she had lived through her own struggles. Her history with her family was complicated, and even now, she didn't always know where she fit. But she had a strength in her, something that reminded me of Mrs. Adams' quiet determination. Clara wasn't looking for approval, just understanding, and that was something I could offer. One afternoon, as we were sitting on the church steps talking, Clara mentioned something that struck me deeply. I used to think money and possessions were everything, she said, looking out at the horizon. I thought they would give me the answers, or at least make me feel like I belonged. But now, I see how much more I have to learn. It's not about what's left behind. It's about what you do with the time you have. Her words lingered in my mind for days. I had spent so much of my life focusing on the wrong things, on what I could gain, on what I thought would bring me happiness. But in the end, Clara had it right. It wasn't about possessions or money, or even the inheritance left behind by Mrs. Adams. It was about the legacy you created with your actions, the way you chose to love, to give, and to contribute. As the months went by, I realized that the legacy I wanted to leave behind wasn't about the things I could accumulate or the recognition I could receive. It was about the relationships I nurtured, the support I gave to others, and the compassion I showed when it was hardest to do so. The church community became my second family, and Clara became a part of that family too. Slowly but surely, we all came to realize that Mrs. Adams had given us a gift much greater than money. She had given us the opportunity to reflect on our own lives and decide what kind of people we wanted to be. Looking back, I could see how everything had unfolded for a reason. Mrs. Adams' death, her will, Clara's return, it was all a catalyst for change, a wake-up call for all of us. It made me realize how precious time really is and how important it is to use it wisely, to live with intention, and to give back. And while I couldn't change the past, I could make sure that my future was different.
I could learn from the mistakes, the betrayals, and the lost opportunities. I could choose to move forward with a clearer sense of purpose, and hopefully, leave behind a legacy that meant something, a legacy that wasn't measured by what I had, but by who I had become. It wasn't until one evening, as I sat in the quiet of my home, that I had a moment of clarity about everything that had happened. It hit me all at once, like a wave washing over me. Mrs. Adams' entire life, her decision to leave everything to the church, her quiet yet undeniable strength, it wasn't just a testament to her generosity, but to her belief in something greater than herself. She didn't want to be remembered by the things she owned or the material wealth she had accumulated. She wanted to be remembered for the love she had given, the lives she had touched, and the change she had sparked in people. I thought about Clara, how she had come to realize the same thing. Despite everything she had been through, despite the years of absence and the complex history with her grandmother, she had come back, not to claim what was rightfully hers, but to find the meaning in Mrs. Adams' legacy and connect with the family she had never truly known. Clara had found her own way, just like Mrs. Adams had, by embracing the true values of life, not the superficial ones. It was clear now, what Mrs. Adams had left behind wasn't just material wealth. It was a challenge to all of us who were left behind to think about how we wanted to live, how we wanted to leave our mark on the world. Mrs. Adams had given us the final push we needed to wake up, to stop living passively, and to start actively shaping the kind of people we wanted to be. And for the first time, I felt at peace with everything that had transpired. The bitterness had dissolved. The anger, the guilt, the confusion, it all faded into the background as I focused on what was important now, the lessons we had learned and how we could apply them to our lives going forward. As I looked around at the community we were building in Mrs. Adams' memory, I realized that this was where the true value lay, not in the dollars, not in the possessions, but in the people, in the bonds we were forming, in the love and support we were offering one another. This was what mattered. I had also come to understand that, while Clara's return to the church was important, it was more about the way she had reshaped her life than anything else. She wasn't asking for pity, or for forgiveness. She had simply come to find her place in a world that had once felt distant and broken. She was learning to let go of her resentment, to forgive herself for the years she had lost, and to honor her grandmother's memory in the most meaningful way possible. The truth was, there were no easy answers, no perfect solutions. People make mistakes, families fall apart, and sometimes, you can't undo the damage that's been done. But you can choose to move forward. You can choose to take responsibility for your own choices and create a better path for the future. I thought about how I could apply this newfound clarity in my own life. I wasn't perfect, and I had a long way to go. But now I had the motivation to live with intention, to prioritize what really mattered, and to focus on the people who truly made a difference in my life. This wasn't just about honoring Mrs. Adams anymore. It was about honoring the lessons she had taught us all, whether we realized it or not. And as I sat there in the quiet, feeling that peace settle over me, I knew that I was finally ready to embrace the future. The more time passed, the more I saw how Mrs. Adams' legacy continued to ripple through our lives in unexpected ways. It wasn't just about what she had left behind, it was about how her actions, her quiet, steadfast approach to life, had influenced so many of us. I watched as Clara found her place in the community, not by clinging to the past, but by moving forward with a new sense of purpose. She had embraced the church and the people in it, not as a means to seek validation, but because she genuinely wanted to be part of something bigger than herself. Her transformation was inspiring. I had seen her struggle with feelings of abandonment and guilt, but over time, she had found a sense of peace. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but rather learning from it and using those lessons to grow. I started to see Clara not as the granddaughter of the woman who had left everything behind, but as someone who was forging her own path. What had been a tangled web of family drama had, in the end, created a sense of unity within the church. The people who had once been bystanders, who had watched Mrs. Adams from a distance, began to come forward with their own stories, their own connections to her. There was a collective feeling that we had all been touched by her in some way, whether we had known her for years or just a short time. The church began to host community dinners and outreach programs in her honor. It wasn't about the money or the possessions, it was about the way she had lived her life, the kindness she had shown even when no one was looking. Slowly, the church became a place of healing, a place where people came together, not just to mourn, but to continue the work Mrs. Adams had started. I found myself becoming more and more involved in these efforts. I wasn't doing it for recognition or for some sense of duty, I was doing it because it felt right. I could see how much it meant to Clara, to the others who had been touched by Mrs. Adams' kindness, and to the people who were still trying to find their way. It was as if we had all been given a second chance, a chance to live differently, to make a real impact. I had started out angry, confused, and unsure about everything. But now, I could look back and see that this whole experience, everything that had happened with Mrs. Adams, the unexpected twists, the betrayals, and the lessons, had been a catalyst for change in my own life. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first heard the news of her heart attack. The church had become a family in a way I hadn't anticipated. And what had started as an event that shook me to my core, became a series of small, quiet decisions that helped me become someone who could genuinely make a difference. The ripple effect was undeniable. Mrs. Adams had lived a life of quiet influence, never seeking attention, never boasting of her generosity or the impact she had made. And yet, in her death, she had created a wave of change that affected all of us. That was her true legacy, not the money, not the silverware, or the crystal. It was the lives she had touched, the lessons she had imparted, and the example she had set. It was the way she had shown us that love and kindness weren't just about grand gestures, they were about the small, consistent acts of care that build a community. I realized then that everything I had learned from Mrs. Adams about humility, about giving, about forgiveness, was something I could carry forward, not just for myself, but for others. Her life had taught me that the most meaningful legacy isn't built on wealth or possessions, but on the way you treat people and the way you make others feel. And as I continued to move forward, I knew that, in some small way, I was carrying that legacy with me too. It had been a year since Mrs. Adams passed away, and the change in the church community was undeniable. What had once been a place where people gathered out of routine had become a space where people genuinely connected, supported one another, and worked together to make a difference. There was still a lingering sadness, of course. Mrs. Adams was missed. But there was also a sense of gratitude, as if her passing had opened our eyes to what really mattered, to what we could accomplish together if we put aside our differences and focused on what was important. Clara had found her rhythm too. I saw her laughing, chatting with the members of the congregation, offering help where it was needed. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She wasn't just Mrs. Adams' granddaughter, the one who had come back to claim a legacy she didn't fully understand. She had become an integral part of this community, and I could see how much it meant to her. She had stopped looking backward, and instead, she was building her own life, one step at a time, in the shadow of her grandmother's influence. I think, in many ways, she had found peace, not just with Mrs. Adams' death, but with her own past. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments where she questioned the choices she'd made or the life she'd lost. But she no longer let those doubts define her. She had embraced her own story, and with it, the future that she could shape for herself. As for me, I had come a long way. The bitterness, the frustration, and the anger that once consumed me had all faded. They had been replaced with something quieter, something more lasting, peace. I had reconciled with the choices I had made and the ways I had failed. I had come to understand that growth isn't always immediate. Sometimes, it happens quietly, in small steps, without you even realizing it. One afternoon, I was sitting on the steps outside the church, just reflecting on everything. Clara came up beside me, sitting down without saying much at first. We both sat there, letting the silence stretch between us, and it felt comfortable. Finally, she spoke. "You know, I never really got the chance to thank you," she said. "For sticking by me, for helping me find my place here." I shook my head. "I didn't do much, Clara. You did the work. You made the decision to show up, to stay. That's the hard part." She smiled, a genuine, soft smile that reached her eyes. I think I'm starting to understand what my grandmother was trying to teach me. It wasn't about the money. It was about the people. It was about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is." I smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I think she would have been proud of you." We sat there for a few more moments, each lost in our own thoughts. But I realized something important in that moment. I had come full circle. From the anger and confusion of the initial news about Mrs. Adams, to the frustration with the way things unfolded, to the acceptance and understanding that came with time, I had learned so much. And now, sitting there beside Clara, I could see that the journey wasn't just about understanding Mrs. Adams' choices. It was about understanding my own, about accepting that the story was still being written, and that I had the power to shape the next chapter. The truth was, none of us could go back and change what had happened. But we could choose to move forward, to live with intention, to honor the people we loved by being better versions of ourselves. The legacy that Mrs. Adams had left behind was more than just a financial inheritance, it was a lesson in how to live, how to love, and how to make the most of the time we had. And in the end, I realized that's the only legacy any of us should aim to leave behind.